It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Daniela Rabellino. So Daniela Rabellino is a research associate at the Department of Psychiatry at Western University and adjunct faculty at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at McMaster University in Canada. She earned her PhD in neuroscience at University of Turin, Italy, and is a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist in Italy and Canada, respectively. Daniela's research focuses on the neural correlates and the biopsychological responses in PTSD and trauma-related dissociative states. She is currently working on sensory motor processing, bodily self-consciousness, gait, and balance in PTSD. So today she is going to talk about the impact of psychological trauma on bodily self-consciousness, body ownership, sense of agency, and peripersonal space in PTSD and its dissociative subtype. So thank you, Daniela.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here and share my work with you. So as you were saying, we're anticipating I'm going to talk about the impact of psychological trauma on bodily self-consciousness. So to start, I'm going to give a brief definition of post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma-related dissociation. And then we're going to together think about bodily self-consciousness in PTSD, how it can appear in the sense of self-identification, body ownership and sense of agency, and in the sense of self-location. So we're going to reflect on peripersonal space in PTSD. And then we're going to just touch upon the neural correlates of bodily self-consciousness in PTSD and the dissociative subtype together. So to start, I just want to give a definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, because this is the way we categorize our population when we conduct our research. So we use a definition from the DSM-5, where it says that post-traumatic stress disorder may follow the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation, or witnessing same type of traumatic events. The symptomatology includes hyperarousal symptoms, such as physiological symptoms like accelerated heart rate, sweating, shallow breath, but also irritation, reckless or aggressive behavior, a general hyper-alertness, hypervigilance. There's also re-experiencing, which is about intrusive memories that spontaneously come up to the mind of the individual that really experience the traumatic event as if it's happening again, reliving the same experience again. It can also be in form of recurrent dreams, nightmares, or daydreams. And then there's avoidance symptoms, which regards avoidance of places, situations, people, but also avoidance of emotions or sensory information. And finally, also negative mood and cognition, which is a plethora of symptoms. For example, impaired memory, gaps in memory, but also low mood, for example, or diminished interest in activities, sense of blame of oneself or others, and sense of shame. So to these prominent symptoms that we see in PTSD, in the last version of the DSM, we also have an additional subtype of PTSD, which is the one that has also dissociative experiences. And here we can see the two examples. One is the depersonalization symptoms, which is about experiencing that a person feels detached from one's own body or parts of the body, where the extreme example is the out-of-body experience, or experiences where the surroundings or the people around you seem unreal, distorted, or dreamlike. So given this definition of PTSD, now we want to reflect upon how bodily self-consciousness can be impacted by psychological trauma. So we started looking at body ownership in PTSD through the experiment of the rubber hand illusion. These are just preliminary results since the sample size is quite small, but these are still very interesting results because they give us suggestions around how PTSD can impact the representation of the self in terms of body ownership and also sense of agency. So a rubber hand illusion study, I'm sure that most of you very well know what that is. I'm just going to briefly say that it's about manipulating the sensory information so that the individual, the participant, feels that the rubber hand that they see is their own hand instead of their own hand, which is hidden from sight. As you can see, the sample size is small, so 7 healthy controls. We had 4 individuals diagnosed with PTSD and 6 individuals diagnosed with the dissociative subtype of PTSD. The clinical assessment comprehended long battery of self-report questionnaires and interviews. Here I'm just reporting the CAPS to assess PTSD, as well as the SCID for comorbidities, SCID-D, and MDI for the dissociative subtype. And the rubber hand illusion effect was measured objectively, let's say, through the proprioceptive drift, and subjectively through the self-report questionnaires for body ownership and sense of agency, using the standard protocols from Botvinnik and Cohen and Calcutt and Harrison. And these are our results. So what we could see is that on the top left, as you can see, there's a difference between the synchronous and asynchronous condition, where we see a larger effect in the synchronous condition. But what's most of interest is that in the PTSD group, we found a significantly decreased effect of the illusion, here in yellow, as compared to the healthy controls, both for the proprioceptive drift and for the subjective perception of the illusion, especially at this item that's reported here. Oppositely, for the dissociative group, we had very different results that were puzzling at first, but then we realized that the results themselves were interesting. Indeed, we saw a highly variance of the effect of the illusion in the dissociative subtype during the synchronous condition, both for the proprioceptive drift and for the subjective ratings. So what these all results mean to us? We tried to give an explanation, and we thought that for the PTSD group, the individuals were resolving the conflict between the top-down cognitive representation of the self and the conflictual sensory information from the manipulation of visual and touch into overcoming the sensory information through the cognitive representation, so suppressing and filtering the sensory information in order to ignore what was conflicting their knowledge and their beliefs about their own representation of the body, where their own hand was. And indeed, we could really see that the subjects were almost resisting the manipulation of the rubber hand illusion. They were scanning the environment. They were trying to make sure to give the right response about the proprioceptive drift. And this really matches with the avoidance strategy of avoiding sensory information that's conflicting the cognitive cognition. So that it seems like the subjects were really suppressing those information in order to also avoid sensory information that could lead to re-experiencing symptoms or hyperarousal symptoms, just suppressing those information. In the dissociative subtype group, what we thought is that the variance, the highly variance, was the result itself. Indeed, dissociation is a state-dependent condition, which can change from one moment to the next. So what we hypothesized here is that these subjects were mirroring the PTSD group response at certain times, so suppressing the sensory information, while at other times they would respond with a strong effect of delusion, with disembodiment and freezing responses. They were also reporting numbing of the rubber hand and feeling dissociative states arising. Also, what we found is that the sense of agency, these are still preliminary too, but consider the PTSD group as a whole, the sense of agency was negatively correlated to the effect of delusion, so that the higher the sense of agency, the lower the effect of delusion and the rubber hand protocol. And they were also reporting verbally after the experiment that they were needing to move the hand in order to maintain or recover the sense of body ownership of the hand. We also have some qualitative interviews after the experiment that are interesting to understand the phenomenology of the body ownership, especially in the Ptsd dissociative subtype. So what we saw are three main patterns of the response. One was that the one's own hidden end was feeling like moving back and forth between the real hand and the rubber hand position. So the subjects were reporting it feels like it's going between numbers, back and forth, back and forth. A second response was feeling that one's own hand had jumped through the box division and become one with the rubber hand, so a very strong effect of the illusion. It didn't drift, it flew, it's like it jumped, and once it was over there, there was no more coming back. And then a third response was that one's own hand was located somewhere in the space, almost floating between the two hands. It felt the sensation, but there was no location to it. You can see your body where it's happening, but it's not happening there, just hanging off in space somewhere. So we really reflect upon this as a conflict between the top-down body representation and the bottom-up sensory processes that actually triggers the familiar sensation for the dissociative subjects of uncertainty about the conflict between their beliefs and what they feel, what is real and what is not. Especially these participant reported, it's a perfect illustration of when you feel and not feel a sensation. When you feel it and then don't feel it in connection with your body, that's the experience when you're really in the middle of something, meaning the dissociative experiences. So this is what we had as a pilot study of the body ownership and sense of agency. Now moving forward to the sense of self-location as bodily self-consciousness, we want to reflect on the peripersonal space and how this can be impacted by psychological trauma. So here we intend that peripersonal space as the space surrounding the body where we can reach objects or can be reached by external entities. And this second function is the one that's mostly important here, considering the peripersonal space as a defensive zone around the body. Especially considering that Ptsd can also be seen as a disorder of the innate alarm system that we all have, but it's a system that's constantly active in Ptsd, scanning the environment to look for potential threatening cues. So before going into that, before going into hypotheses of how trauma can impact peripersonal space, let's just look at few studies that can be useful to hypothesize on Ptsd. So let's look at how psychological traits or states can impact the peripersonal space. This study from the in 2016, they were studying peripersonal space, and what they found is that the tactile reaction times were faster when an approaching stimulus was closer to the body of the participants. But what's mostly important is that this effect of distance on reaction times was larger when the participants saw an approaching spider compared to an approaching butterfly, but only for arachnophobic participants. So what this means is that the appraisal, the valence of the stimulus is important, and it's impacting the representation of the peripersonal space. So evaluating this stimulus as threatening can modulate the representation of a peripersonal space, which is very important for a Ptsd individual, as we saw before. And then also higher anxiety scores were related to larger defensive peripersonal space using the hand blink reflex measurements to measure peripersonal space, as well as high claustrophobic fear was related to larger peripersonal space around the body as compared to low claustrophobic fear. And also what I want to highlight here is that high claustrophobic individuals were showing a decreased flexibility of the peripersonal space when using a tool. So we know the peripersonal space can be plastic, but for these individuals, the flexibility was decreased, was impaired as compared to low claustrophobic score individuals. I'm still going to present this reflection from Noel and colleagues because it was very illuminating to understand PTC and the dissociative subtype. Here, we're focusing on the boundaries of the peripersonal space. So they were proposing in this article that looking at autism spectrum disorder and schizophrenia and peripersonal space, what they were suggesting is that on the extreme right, as you can see, in autism spectrum disorder, the peripersonal space would have a steep boundaries. So a steep differentiation between peripersonal and extrapersonal space that will be associated with an inflexibility in altering one's own self-location. In schizophrenia, instead, individuals with schizophrenia would manifest peripersonal space boundaries that would be shallow. So a lower, weaker differentiation between peripersonal and extrapersonal space, between self and other space, which would match with the proneness tendency to disembodiment. So here is our hypothesis at this point on Ptsd and dissociative subtype. But before, there's one more study that was actually conducted on Ptsd individuals, specifically in male war veterans, trauma exposed. So they were comparing with Ptsd and non-Ptsd trauma exposed male war veterans. This study was conducted in 2013, and they were using a stop distance paradigm. So they were asking the participant to just tell another person to stop when they felt that the other person approaching was crossing their boundaries of the peripersonal space around them. So what they found, just measuring this space, is that the individuals with Ptsd showed a larger interpersonal space distance around their own body as compared to the controls. And also they showed a larger peripersonal space at the back as compared to the front, as opposed to what was happening to the controls. And now with the hypothesis in Ptsd and the dissociative subtype. So we hypothesize that in Ptsd, on the extreme right, as we can see, we think they will show a larger size of the peripersonal space around the body, thinking about that defensive zone around the body, but also steep boundaries between peripersonal and extrapersonal space, matching the inflexibility that they showed in the representation of the body ownership. Instead, we hypothesized that the dissociative subtype group would show a high variance of the peripersonal space around the body that would be state dependent and changing from one moment to the next. And also we hypothesize shallow boundaries in the dissociative subtype with a tendency to, of course, depersonalization symptoms of disembodiment. These are still hypotheses that we still have to implement in experimental research, but we do have some data from neuroimaging that might support the hypothesis of an altered representation of the self in sense of bodily self-consciousness. So we looked at neural correlates of Ptsd, where Ptsd would show altered neural activity or functional connectivity. And we looked at the overlap with areas that instead are also involved in bodily self-consciousness and peripersonal space. And in red here, you can see the areas that are both involved in Ptsd and bodily self-consciousness. So you can see a huge overlap, for example, in the insula, putamen, but all the cortical regions, such as the supramarginal gyrus, intraparietal sulcus, postcentral gyrus, premotor cortex, insula, as we said before, and the cerebellum. And to go on, I just want to briefly talk about several studies that were conducted in our lab on the resting state, functional connectivity in Ptsd and the dissociative subtype. And what was found is that areas involved in bodily self-consciousness at rest were showing altered functional connectivity. Cortical regions such as insula, temporoparietal junction, subcortical regions in the brainstem, as well as cerebellar regions, all involved in bodily self-consciousness and sensory motor processing. And specifically here, I just want to report this data from a study we conducted on the resting state functional connectivity of the anterior cerebellum, which can also be called the sensory motor cerebellum. And what we found, especially in the dissociative subtype, is a decreased functional connectivity and rest of the anterior cerebellum with areas involved in bodily self-consciousness, such as the supramarginal gyrus, the angular gyrus, and the TPJ, the temporoparietal junction, as compared to the control group and as compared to the PTSD group, really reminding us of the personalization symptoms and alteration in the representation of the self in the body. To conclude, there's still so many open questions to explore in PTSD and trauma-related dissociation. For example, I haven't talked about how the type of trauma can affect the bodily self-consciousness, if it's childhood trauma instead of trauma not halted, interpersonal trauma. Experimental research is warranted, of course, and more on body ownership, sense of agency, but peripersonal space. And what's very important too is what are the clinical implications of our knowledge about bodily self-consciousness. So how can we include this knowledge in the therapeutic intervention related to self-identification in terms of body ownership, peripersonal space, and sense of agency. Acknowledging the amazing Ruth Lanius lab and collaboration at McMaster, as well as Dali Laborin in Japan. And I'm reporting just references because I was just mentioning before, just to make more detailed references. So thank you all for listening and attending, and I'm open to all the questions that you might have now.
Thank you, Daniela, for this amazing talk. As we discussed in the past days, probably I am a little bit biased, but I think that even if this study about the correlation, the relation between trauma and multisensory integration, body ownership, peripersonal space is still in its infancy, it's very promising. So thank you for joining us and to share all your data with us. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do. Waiting for attend these questions. I was wondering, because I know that you work around gait and balance in PTSD patients. So can you give us just a flavor of your data? Because probably they could be in a way connected to the peripersonal space that we know is plastic during a walk, for example. I don't know if you have some to share.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for the question. I have to admit that study is still in its infancy as well. Also because of the pandemic, our lab closed down. Literally, we were in lockdown 3 times. Yes, 3 times in a row. So the empirical research has been really slow lately. We have some preliminary results, and I have to say that we've seen a few patients, and in the dissociative subtype, we still see a highly variance also of what we've looked so far is the balance mainly. So the center of gravity changing, and probably this really the state dependent symptomatology that these patients have is really impacting also how we do research. So we really need to explore this data in a different way, measuring state by state. So it's no more a matter of pre-post measurement, but also during the experimentation. So that's what we've seen so far. We've also seen some let's say contradictory data with respect to the literature, but I'm not going to say more right now because I don't think we have much data yet. Yeah. Probably also we're using a trauma stimuli, individualized stimuli that might also impact, the results, and so that's where we are at. But I'm glad that there's excitement around it and interest. Thank you.
Thank you. And we also know from the epidemiological report that the majority of patients suffering from the dissociative subtype of PTSD were victims of early or chronic trauma or traumatic experiences. So do you think that these two factors, so the earlier experience of trauma and its chronicity, there are obviously overlapping, because we know that we cannot cut sharply these two factors. I have to say something in this debate about the specificity of this particular subtype and what you show about body ownership and all the other phenomena.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think that childhood trauma, of course, impact the development of the representation of the sense of self. So when trauma occurs early in life, and especially when it's cumulative, it has to impact how we represent our body, and the strategies to disembody or depersonalization are started to use at a very early age, right? So it becomes really a coping strategy that's developed during childhood. What's important to say here is that we do have data on childhood trauma through the childhood trauma questionnaire that we use. However, we don't have enough data so far to say something that really shows a significant difference or significant correlation so far. But what we see clinically, of course, is that the dissociative subtype of PTSD is related to childhood trauma. So when childhood trauma happens, it's more likely to develop also dissociative experiences and the dissociative subtype of PTSD.
So there's something.
Yes, yes.
So there's something specific about dissociation in PTSD. No, it's not a matter of dissociation in general. It's not the same thing. It's something specific.
Yes, that's correct. That's right. And also adding to this, even when PTSD is developed in adulthood, very often clinically we see that childhood traumas reemerge. So they were not present in the awareness of the individual until adulthood, and when a traumatic event occurs in adulthood, the childhood trauma sort of reemerge. So really, I think the development of the representation of the self during childhood really matters and impact.
The long-lasting effect of on mental health. Thank you, Daniela, for this also deep discussion about this topic. I think that we have done right for today. No more questions. So we all came to the end of this first day of our workshop. We really want to thank. Okay, I stand up because I feel a little bit. We really want to thank all the speakers who joined us and who gave their brief talk. Every single talk was so inspiring, and you also really participate in the discussion. So everything goes far behind our better expectations. So thank you so much, really. But actually, the day is not yet done. This evening, we have the pleasure to host this amazing conversation between Dr. Siri Husvet and Dr. Anna Chaunica at 6 p.m. our time, so chess time zone. Please don't miss it. It will be a wonderful conclusion of the day, and if you miss it, it for sure is going to be your worst decision. Not in life, but for this week for sure. So have a rest, will do for sure, and see you at 6 p.m. Arrivederci, a più tardi.